All right, welcome to our journey through chapter 1 of Philip Cary's book, The Meaning of Protestant Theology. I do apologize for barraging all these videos all in one day. This idea has kind of been in the works for a while, but while I've been reading, so we've kind of stacked up about 3 chapters that I need to kind of review and go through, and I want to make sure I'm kind of trying it out as we go along. We'll see how these how they develop and how they get clarified. But so chapter 1 in this book, The Meaning of Protestant Theology, is called Philosophical Spirituality. And the way I want to kind of introduce it is to consider this kind of data I've observed as a evangelical become Lutheran, or as a Reformed become Lutheran, kind of Reformed Baptist become Lutheran, is the Reformed Christianity in which I was raised and that you experience predominantly in American culture is very excited and very deeply values the attributes of God, his omnipotence, his sovereignty, his omniscience, and his omnipresence, the truths about God's being. And those are important. Lutheran Christianity believes in all of that, the traditional attributes of God, but we're far less excited about it. We're far more excited about the actions of God, the fact that God was the dude who died on the cross, that God was the one who raised Jesus from the dead, right? Those specific actions of God in the story, we just front those more in the way we talk about the gospel. Why is that, though? Why is it? Supposing that's true for a second, that's my experience of it. Well, why is that true? And this is ultimately one of the questions that I think is answered by a deep dive into is what this book is really about, a deep dive into the philosophy, into the context of the Reformation, So that's what chapter 1 is going to look at. And he starts with the basic point that Protestant theology in the Reformation in the 1500s, it bursts onto the scene in European West, and it does so in the context of what he calls Augustinian spirituality. That is, the theology of the West is all downstream from a church father named Saint Augustine. Incredibly important, and you can't understand what it means to be, well, a Western Christian without understanding your relationship to Augustine. And so this book this first chapter looks at, well, what was, if everything in the Protestant Reformation is downstream of Augustine and interacts with him in an important way, well, what do we know about Augustine, and what does it mean to be part of Augustine's tradition? How did he shape the church to reflect on these things? So this first chapter dives into Augustine's own context as the critical appropriation of Platonism. This is the dominant form of philosophy in the ancient world that kind of set the stage for the early church thinking about the being of God, thinking about subjects like the Trinity, and then how we as Christians relate to God. And it shaped in many ways. And one of Cary's arguments is that Platonism gave some very helpful tools to the church, but it also was used in some ways that were ultimately less helpful to understanding the gospel. And so let's dive into what's really helpful about this chapter is that he dives real deep into the nature of Platonist spirituality as valuing form over matter. That is, think for a second of, it's math. Math's probably the easiest way to think about this. That, you can have the form of a triangle, right? I could draw you a triangle on a piece of paper, but if you can contemplate in your mind the idea of a triangle, and you can contemplate a perfect triangle, and then you can think through certain truths about that triangle, like, for example, that the sum of all of its angles always adds up to 180 degrees, right? That's a truth about triangles that will always be true, no matter how you draw it. If you draw a shape that is the intersection of 3 straight lines, it will always have, you add up all the angles, it'll always have 180 degrees. That truth of that spiritual truth for Platonists can be applied to things like bowls or objects out in the world. So a bowl is a bowl because it shares in the form of a bowl, that is, of a thing that holds some liquid. And so maybe you break the glass bowl in front of you or the clay bowl in front of you, but that doesn't change the idea of a bowl. Now, Cary kind of helps you see how, suppose the strength of Platonism is that it takes this and does it with the idea of justice or truthfulness. And so we are not going to fit this into 5 minutes. And for Platonism, the value was placing these spiritual ideas, the ideas that you can contemplate with your mind, the absolute unchanging truths, as higher and of more important than your sense experience, right? So think, for instance, let's go to the famous analogy of the cave. Plato suggested this, allegory of the cave, that we can think of of the world, of the universe, like a couple people who are bound in a cave, and they can only see the wall. A wall is right in front of them, and from behind them, there's a light and fire burning, and other people are holding up shapes in front of this light to cast shadows on the wall. Now, for Plato, you are one of those people locked in the cave. You're looking at the wall, and all you see are the shadows. That is your sense experience. That is what you see out in the world. It's a shadow of the truth. And one of the goals of Platonist spirituality is to liberate you from the cave, that is, to liberate you from bondage to the shadows and your sense experience, and help walk you out, not just to see the fire and the images, but to get out of the cave and go see the real things. So think, for an instance, of the shadow of an elephant, and then the image, the drawing of an elephant that's being used to cast the shadow on the wall. But through reason and philosophy, and through contemplating the idea of changeless forms, the goal of the philosopher is to walk you out of the cave and into the light, and you see real elephants. Now, the idea here is that you are liberated through contemplating that which is changeless and eternal. So the idea here then is that the material things that we see, like our actual sense experience of me seeing an elephant, is less real than the idea of an elephant, or the instances I see in the world of justice are mere reflections of the ideal of justice, the truth about justice. And okay, so if you have this distinction between the true unchanging form and the particular material thing that instantiates that form, well, okay, how does this relate? How does this shape for Christian spirituality? Well, if Christian spirituality is put in this framework, what you find is, okay, what's the goal of the gospel, of what's the goal of being saved, is coming to know God as the true good, the true justice, the unchanging form of justice and truth. So for the Christian tradition took Platonism and said, well, let's see. The idea, let me focus on the idea of intellectual vision, because if we don't get that, then we're not going to understand what follows. But that Platonism basically gives the idea that the way to understand the truth is through intellectual seeing. The way in your mind you can see a perfect triangle, and you can see the way that its angles work together, more so than, say, on a paper when you draw it out. And material things, that is the actual, the real triangle on the page, those are always imperfect and corruptible in some way. And this is going to be in deep tension with a gospel that says Jesus came into the materiality. He came into the form, he came into the matter. He came down here. So if we want to know God, we know him through the material things, not through climbing up to the form of God. So this probably could have been summarized better. I'm not sure I'm really excited about this. We're going on 8 minutes. The end result, though, is that in the Platonist context, the idea of the closer you get to the truth means the more inward and mental you get. And so the spirituality which grows from this is a spirituality of ascent of the mind beyond the things that are merely transitory and corruptible. That's actually a big term we need to talk about, corruptibility. Why are physical bowls, or the Tupperware, why are they less good than the idea of the bowl? Well, because they're corruptible, right? You can break it, you can change it. And so material things are corruptible and therefore less good, less real. Whereas spiritual things, intelligible things, they last forever. And we become closer to reality by contemplating those things. Well, that's going to face a really interesting question when the story of the gospel is that the true, the good, and the beautiful God, the eternal, changeless God, became material. So the question then is, did he do it in order to rescue us from material, like a divine rescue mission? He came a man in order to snatch us out of materiality and raise us to the immaterial world? Or did he do it because perhaps there's actually something good about the material world? And that's going to be a tension that we're going to see develop, is that the gospel benefits from understanding Platonism in one way, but it actually breeds a notion, or it brings a notion of spirituality that leads in the opposite direction of the gospel, which sees material things as less real, less valuable, and less important. So that's all for chapter 1. I might delete this and have another go at it. We're going on 10 minutes now. So that's that. We'll let that be right there.